Unlocking the queenside, this flank opening immediately contests central space and prepares queenside expansion for white. Developing the knight towards the center, this flexes influence and prepares for pawn advances, setting up flexible counterplay. Developing the knight to c3 supports the central pawn thrust and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a comfortable middle game structure. Immediately contesting central space with a pawn is a bold declaration, aiming to disrupt white's solid pawn structure before it solidifies. Solidifying the queenside space allows for kingside expansion, preparing a fianchetto that controls the long diagonal. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's central space and opens lines for quick development. Immediately clarifying the central pawn structure, white opens a path for the bishop to develop and potentially pressure black's queenside development. Recapturing the pawn immediately opens up the d-file for future central control and initiates an active pawn structure for black. Developing the bishop to this diagonal prepares to exert pressure along the long diagonal and supports the center, a solid positional stance. Shifting the knight to c7 opens lines for the queen and prepares to challenge white's central space. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the light-squared bishop is the rationale behind this steady pawn advance, aiming to gain breathing room for the kingside. Immediately seizing central real estate with this pawn thrust injects dynamism, challenging white's kingside fianchetto and aiming to establish a commanding pawn presence. Unleashing the queen to b3 immediately pressures black's central pawn structure, threatening to exploit the d5 square and create an outpost. This aggressive deployment forces black to consider defending or accepting a structural imbalance. Centering the knight on c6 reestablishes a defensive presence for the d5 pawn, a crucial piece in this English opening setup, while also preparing potential pawn advances on the kingside. Striking the knight on c6 immediately alters the pawn structure, opening a diagonal for white's queen and potentially liberating black's bishop on c8. This decision gambles on exploiting the resulting doubled pawns and the isolated queen's pawn on d5, aiming for a more dynamic middle game where white's piece activity could overwhelm black's less flexible setup. Accepting the doubled pawns fundamentally alters black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses but also opening the b-file for the rook, a crucial piece in the ensuing queenside play. This exchange sacrifices structural integrity for a more active piece placement, a dynamic decision that requires careful handling to avoid overextension. Unmasking the queen to exploit the doubled pawns and initiate an assault on the weakened queenside structure, while simultaneously creating potential forks and pressure on the c-file. Unifying the queen with the bishop on the long diagonal offers immediate tactical possibilities, while also preparing to develop the queenside pieces, potentially eyeing the weakened dark squares around white's king. Developing the knight to f3 aims to pressure black's central pawn structure and prepare for kingside castling, solidifying white's central influence after the exchange on c6. Consolidating the pawn structure by reinforcing e5, this move aims to create a solid central bastion, though it does concede some kingside mobility for the moment. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside signals white's aggressive intent, aiming to pry open lines against black's potentially vulnerable monarch, while simultaneously creating new attacking pathways. Bolstering the kingside pawn chain with this defensive step, black aims to prevent white's immediate pawn thrusts and potentially gain breathing room, though it creates a permanent structural weakness on the light squares. The queen's relocation here dramatically alters the central tension, shifting the focus from immediate pawn capture to a broader positional reshuffling. Black's somewhat awkward pawn structure, particularly the isolated c-pawn, now becomes a potential target in this new configuration. Developing the rook to the b-file immediately challenges white's central queen and simultaneously prepares to potentially seize control of that open file, creating serious pressure down the line. The monarch's position is now severely compromised as the queen infiltrates a vital diagonal, forcing a difficult decision and exposing weaknesses that have been quietly building. The king's relocation to d8 while ostensibly seeking safety, now presents a rather exposed posture, inviting further probing from white's queen, and potentially sacrificing valuable time that could be better spent developing pieces or fortifying central control. A daring repositioning, e4 injects immediate central tension by threatening to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's monarch, and aiming to disrupt any nascent queenside pawn structure with a potential e5 advance. Reclaiming central squares and preparing to challenge the bishop's influence represents a sound strategic adjustment for black, aiming to bolster the king's safety and develop a more cohesive pawn structure. Instead of passively reacting to white's queenside pressure, this knight maneuver bravely ventures into a more active post, intending to disrupt white's queenside dominance and create counterplay by targeting the weakened c-pawn. Recognizing the exposed nature of white's king after the recent pawn thrusts, black initiates a plan to exploit this vulnerability, seeking to open lines of attack and coordinate pieces for a decisive assault. The knight's repositioning signifies a commitment to positional play, subtly reinforcing black's central control and setting the stage for future pawn advances or piece transfers aimed at exploiting white's slightly awkward pawn formation. This seemingly quiet move is actually quite ambitious, hinting at a desire to activate the queen's bishop and connect the rooks, transforming the board into a more dynamic battleground where black seeks to dictate the tempo. The king abandons its sanctuary, a daring gambit to escape the queenside pressure and find refuge on the kingside. This maneuver signals a shift towards a more active, if inherently risky, defensive posture, aiming to untangle pieces and perhaps prepare for a centralized counterassault, while simultaneously exposing a crucial diagonal to potential enemy incursions. Developing the bishop to a square that influences the center and supports the pawn chain, while also preparing for castling, demonstrates a sound understanding of piece activity and king safety, a crucial balance to strike in this dynamic English opening where white's queen has aggressively occupied central squares. Rather than fortifying the king, white opts for a subtle repositioning, aiming to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially eyeing e4 or f5. This maneuver subtly shifts the battleground towards the queenside, where black's rook on b8 and knight on c6 are already somewhat confined. The pawn on h5, while seemingly aggressive, now presents a long-term weakness that white might exploit later. The knight's journey from d2 suggests a desire to escape the pin on the c3-f6 diagonal and potentially join the kingside attack, or at least support a future pawn push. It's a move prioritizing flexibility and piece development over immediate confrontation. Black recenters their queen, aiming to find a safer square and potentially participate in the central pawn battle or support kingside expansion, while white's knight on d2 adopts a passive stance, awaiting deployment. Unlocking the queenside's potential, a3 aims to create breathing room for white's pieces, potentially preparing a b4 push to disrupt black's central pawn structure and gain dominion over the queenside expanses. A quiet consolidation, this bishop retreat reestablishes the pawn chain's integrity and prepares to connect the rooks, offering defensive solidity against the queenside pressure white has been building. Refocusing the queen back to the center of the board, white aims to pressure the d5 pawn and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously keeping an eye on black's somewhat exposed king. Unleashing the knight to d4 injects immediate central pressure, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and coordinate with its centralized counterpart. Here's a more varied comment. By anchoring the knight on d4, black boldly challenges white's central control and prepares for potential tactical fireworks. Opening the e-file and clearing the way for your rook to join the attack is a significant positional concession, essentially trading a well-placed knight for a pawn and exposing your king. Recapturing on d4 opens up the e-file for the rook, finally activating that piece which has been a bystander so far, while simultaneously creating an immediate pawn chain on the queenside, hinting at future queenside expansion. Trading off the queens here, after a rather topsy-turvy opening, signals a definitive shift toward an endgame where white seeks to exploit black's compromised queenside pawn structure. The doubled c-pawns, while initially creating some defensive possibilities, will likely become targets once the most potent attacking pieces are off the board, and the pawn will need constant vigilance. This simplification, though seemingly straightforward, forces black to carefully consider piece placement to avoid static weaknesses, especially on the queen side where white might try to infiltrate later. Accepting the queen exchange fundamentally reshapes the battlefield, opening up the c-file for your rook and initiating an endgame where pawn structure integrity becomes paramount. Probing for weaknesses on the queen side, this move seeks to exploit the pawn chain's imbalance and potentially open lines for an assault against black's exposed king position later. Black seizes the initiative, anchoring the bishop on a key outpost to disrupt white's coordination and prepare for queenside counterplay along the newly opened half-open c-file. Securing the king from potential future skirmishes on the king side, this maneuver prioritizes defensive solidity, a sensible choice given the board's open nature and black's potentially active pieces poised on the queen side. Bringing the king to the center of the board in this phase of the game, especially after the rook has been activated, signals an intention to consolidate and prepare for future maneuvers rather than immediate pawn pushing. Reinforcing the pawn chain's anchor on the queen side, this bishop relocation aims to pressure the weak d4 pawn and indirectly support the central advance, while preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Black finally centralizes the rook, aiming to contest the open c-file and offer piece coordination. Assuming control of the semi-open c-file, this rook now stands poised to exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, potentially exploiting weaknesses created by the earlier pawn exchanges. Exploring the centralizing potential for the monarch, key 6 now confronts the looming rook on the c-file. Initiating the exchange of rooks here dramatically simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the structural weaknesses black has accumulated, particularly the isolated d-pawn and the somewhat exposed monarch after white's queenside play. This decision signals a transition towards an endgame where black's doubled pawns on the c-file might become a liability, and the open b-file offers white potential penetration. The rook finally finds its rightful place on the open file, a testament to the quiet struggle for central control that has been unfolding. Securing the crucial open file for its rook with this action crystallizes white's strategic objective, preparing to exert pressure on black's potentially vulnerable doubled pawns and coordinated pieces. Opening the c-file for the remaining rook, this exchange is a logical consequence of white's earlier exchanges, aiming to activate black's last major piece. Reclaiming the bishop fundamentally alters the queenside structure, solidifying white's control over the open c-file while simultaneously simplifying the position towards a more manageable endgame. The bishop retreats, seeking sanctuary after the rook exchange, aiming to solidify a defense from the open file. Reasserting control over the central file, the king steps out of the corner, a surprisingly active repositioning in this unusual endgame scenario, aiming to escape the looming threats and potentially support pawns or influence the remaining open files. The bishop's return to c2, after a brief excursion, aims to reposition itself for potential support of the queenside pawns or to participate in the battle for the central open files, though its immediate impact is rather limited given the current pawn structure and piece distribution. Activating the knight to a more central square offers the possibility of better knight maneuverability and prepares for potential advances on the queenside or even a foray towards the king should the opportunity arise. The black king, having shuffled around the board, now seeks refuge on d7, aiming to connect with its remaining pieces and perhaps initiate a regrouping maneuver. Repositioning the monarch to the king side provides essential support for potential pawn advances, aiming to exploit the open files and consolidate the advantage gained from the queen trade. The bishop's redeployment to the queenside aims to influence the d-file and potentially stir up trouble on the weakened queenside pawns, but it leaves the king somewhat exposed to potential checks on the c-file if white can reposition their pieces effectively. The monarch ventures towards the queenside, a curious sidestep that sacrifices central influence for potential pawn breaks or simply a more active role in the developing skirmishes. Reorganizing the knight to patrol the central squares from its new post on c6 adds a defensive layer, preparing to contest the open c-file and prevent further white incursions. Securing the bishop's position on b2 offers a more robust centralizing influence, preparing for potential pawn advances in the queenside or bolstering the defense should black's king venture too far from its current stronghold. Consolidating the king's position on the queenside opens up avenues for counterplay, aiming to exploit the slight awkwardness of white's bishop placement and potentially prepare for a pawn push on the kingside. Repositioning the bishop to the c1 square reclaims a more active diagonal and anticipates a potential pawn push from black's bishop on a4, offering a more flexible defense of white's queenside pawns while preparing to potentially contest the open files with its rooks later. Unlocking the queenside requires exploiting any territorial advantage, and this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's established structure while seeking fresh avenues of attack by opening a path for the rook. Sacrificing a pawn here to gain initiative, forcing black to recapture and solidify white's control of the b-file, while simultaneously creating a passed pawn on the queenside that will become a significant threat in the ensuing endgame. Seizing the open file, the king becomes an active participant in the endgame, pushing toward the center to support the pawns. Reactivating the knight to a more active central square after the rook exchange, this knight's journey to e1 signals a shift towards consolidating white's pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, while also looking to exploit any weaknesses in black's king's safety. Harnessing the bishop's influence to activate the queenside pawns and potentially disrupt white's unified pawn structure on the kingside is the primary aim here. A calculated repositioning, this knight aims to fortify the central pawn structure, preparing for a potential advance or to support defensive maneuvers. Finally, black decides to resolve the structural imbalance created by the earlier exchange, directly addressing the weakness that the isolated d-pawn represented. By capturing the bishop, black aims to simplify into an endgame where the extra pawn might become more relevant, though the opponent's well-placed knight still presents a significant threat to the exposed black king. Seizing the central pawn opens a direct path for your king to join the endgame fray, a welcome development after a lengthy maneuvering phase. The monarch's perilous journey across the open board, venturing into the enemy's territory without adequate support, invites immediate tactical retribution and further isolation. Opening the diagonal for the bishop to target the advanced pawn, this maneuver attempts to exploit the king's somewhat exposed position by creating future attacking possibilities along the file. Exploiting the newly opened diagonal, black bravely snatches an unprotected pawn, a bold gambit that forces white to reevaluate the material balance and the stability of their queenside structure in this suddenly complex endgame. Shifting the bishop to the e1 square aims to redeploy this piece to a more active diagonal, perhaps the b4 h8 threat, after the pawn advances. Repositioning the bishop to the queenside opens a vital diagonal for the rook on the f-file, aiming to exploit the isolated pawns and create counterplay. Capturing the bishop fundamentally alters the material balance, leaving black with a significant pawn advantage, but a somewhat disconnected structure that could become a liability in a longer endgame. The king's journey across the open expanse now solidifies a tentative foothold, aiming to consolidate its position within the enemy's territory by leveraging the secured dark squares and potential pawn advances. The white king cautiously advances, seeking a more active role in the unfolding endgame by stepping onto the lighter squares and preparing to influence the central pawn structure. A new pawn push on the kingside, g6, attempts to shore up the king's immediate vicinity and perhaps prepare for a pawn storm, but it significantly weakens the dark squares around the monarch, potentially opening avenues for white's remaining pieces to exploit the newly created vulnerabilities. Solidifying the pawn structure, this establishes a more robust central presence and prepares for potential advances on the kingside. Challenging the pawn structure by advancing the f-pawn immediately creates dynamic potential, aiming to disrupt white's kingside defense and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces. Opening up the f-file now allows your rook to infiltrate the opponent's weakened queenside structure. Breaching the pawn structure with this advance creates dynamic counterplay, challenging white's consolidated central control and aiming to unravel the game in black's favor. Re-establishing the king's central position is paramount now, aiming to find a safer haven and potentially participate in the coming pawn skirmishes. Venturing towards the queenside flank opens up new avenues, but it also exposes the monarch to potential counterplay along the third rank should the pawn chain buckle. Securing your monarch is paramount as the pawn structure thins and opposing bishops eye open diagonals. Unleashing the king to its full potential, this maneuver aims to exploit the open diagonals and centralize black's monarch, a crucial step as the board simplifies and pawn play becomes paramount. The monarch recenters, seeking better shelter and potential activation on the queenside as the pawn structure on that flank begins to solidify. Navigating the nascent endgame, black repositions their monarch to the queenside, seeking to activate it along the second rank. Opening the center like this forces a simplified endgame, where white's remaining pawns might become targets for the black king's active participation. The pawn's advance finally opens a path, a welcome sight after the prolonged blockade, offering a sliver of hope for regaining central influence and potentially activating the inactive king.